You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host. As always, Brendon Ptolomey is back in the studio to discuss the regional market. As always, it's been a quarter already. Can't actually believe that since our last chat with Brendon about our regional markets. And we're going to start with Karratha today. Mate, how you going?
Yeah, I'm great, mate. Thank you very much for having me in amongst this world turmoil out there and tariff deals flying around all over the place. Trump trying to do individual deals with individual countries and even finding out new countries that we didn't even know existed and trying to level tariffs on them. Thankfully, he didn't come out and go, Karratha's its own country and we'll level a tariff on everything they produce there.
But it is important though, right? Karratha is our centre of iron ore, steel being obviously outcome of our northwest industry at the end of the day through China. And it's important, I think, for us to get straight into that conversation of, does it affect us up there? Is it already affecting the market? What's the dynamic on the ground in K-Town?
Yeah, really interestingly, our valuer on the ground up there, Mel, is coming back to me saying that essentially there's still really limited supply in the marketplace. So let's just remember that historic issue that we have in terms of cost of construction and ability to supply into the marketplace. State government and the local council have done an amazing job in terms of trying to create some sort of supply in there, whether it be apartments or land, in particular land's becoming more available.
Madison, the suburb there they've created?
Yeah, and they've cracked that nut slightly. Now we're up against the next challenge, and that is how do you create housing in those locations when it's so expensive to build? So that means that it flows into an ongoing issue of very limited supply.
The other thing you could have said coming out of that intro was, yeah, you're right, Trent, everyone's scared, people are selling en masse just like they did 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But you didn't say that.
No, exactly. And so the other thing is that there's surging demand there. So again, rents are holding up really well, values are increasing, and essentially investors are finding returns in terms of their return on investment and the rents holding up. But in particular too, there's some demonstrated value increase in the marketplace, which means it gives potential purchasers the confidence that values will continue to go up over a period of time.
How does that compute? Because I think the last 2 quarters you've told us that Karratha has pretty much just been steady as she goes, no value increase, no drops, pretty relaxed market of just cracking on, which is nice to hear for a place like Karratha, to be honest.
Yeah.
And then in a time where perceivably there is the most risk in the steel iron ore space, now you're saying people are buying in and no one's selling.
Yeah, exactly. And so let's just remember that this is instant data coming from the ground in terms of our value that is working there every single day of the week. And we might see potentially consumer confidence drop away and therefore not want to buy into that market as a result of what's happening with tariffs. But
it's not happening right now.
It's not happening right this minute. And in fact, we've got some examples there of purchase prices in the $600,000 to $700,000 value range 4 to 5 years ago. Good housing stock in good locations, essentially renovated and not extended because that's difficult to do, but patios put on and pools put in, and they're selling for over $1 million now.
Back in the last mining boom, we obviously saw prices get crazy, rents get even crazier. And we think about Perth. Most of Perth's suburbs now have cracked the last mining boom prices. Has Karratha?
So right at the minute, that's still below where it peaked out in the last mining boom. The same product that I just described then, I remember doing purchase price valuations in Karratha, 4x2, good stock, patio, pool, shed, which are all the boxes you need to tick for
red
lifestyle.
Dust on the concrete.
Plenty of red dust around. And I remember that being in a good cul-de-sac too. Had some lovely palm trees, this property. And it had sold for just over $1.4 million. So we're still shy of that in terms of value growth and where we peaked out in the last boom.
Isn't that funny, the volatility there? It was obviously the fastest growing part of the country for a while there. It was on many pages of the Australian Property Investors magazine back in the day, back when they did a physical magazine.
Yeah.
Everyone was talking about Karratha like they did Gladstone, and still 10 years later now, it is one of the last regions left in WA that hasn't gone past its 2014 mining boom prices, and it was the epicenter of the mining boom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and everyone was scrambling back then. We were flying in and out in terms of the valuations we're doing, and just even to find somewhere to stay overnight when you needed to undertake our job was super, super difficult. Yeah.
What gives people perspective to know that. Okay, that's Karratha. It's probably a bit of an uptick in comparison to the last couple of quarters that you've reported on.
Yeah, yep. And just remember that those cycles in terms of activity in Karratha can be relatively short. So just from month to month, it is a little bit like the suburb that you live in. There can be a slight oversupply one month where a whole lot of people decide to sell and there's a little bit of activity into the next month where there's an undersupply. So it can change relatively quickly just because of the size of the town.
They're doing well, but wait and see, given the turmoil around the world,
Yeah.
if anyone's going to be affected, it might be Karratha.
Yeah, and if you're trying to buy in there at the moment, there's not a huge amount to choose from.
All right, let's go to Hedland.
Yeah, so Port Hedland, there's good product, essentially is not lasting on the market for very long. So essentially anything that's been renovated will achieve a premium value. Then the other thing that's happening is that rents are still holding up. So then they're definitively not decreasing. And essentially landlords that are active in terms of maintaining their market rental are looking for increases in those rents.
We know supply is not changing in Hedland. It's not going up, right? So that's not the reason for rents changing or not changing. It has to just be demand, population, right?
Yeah.
So what it means is that we're not losing people out of Hedland.
Yes, we're actually losing housing stock in terms of the port buyback and essentially the repurposing of the land that's close to the port there.
That's a good point.
We're also lost a pub, which provided accommodation as well. I know it's not long-term accommodation, but it does actually provide beds for people. And so in terms of choosing to live in that part of the world, obviously Port Hedland's very much a better lifestyle opportunity being on the coast as opposed to South Headland. And so it's just driving values and rents in particular to be maintained and go up because of the demand in town.
Okay, South Headland.
Yeah, so South Headland's still going quite strong. The growth has actually slowed down slightly because we did have a pretty significant growth side of things there, but supply is starting to meet demand, so slightly more balanced type market and rents that are underpinned but probably not under as much pressure as the Port Hedland rents, essentially. So landlords not being able to get an increase in their rental as readily as they might have been able to if they put the pressure on in Port Hedland.
So balanced right now. I guess the future will tell whether this is a peak or whether this is just a plateau on the way to further increases. I think that's very much just market-based.
Yeah.
Let's go to your favourite part of the world, Gero.
Yeah, Gero. I'm driving to Exmouth pretty soon, so looking forward to the stopover through Gero. So really strong market. So this goes back to the comments that we would have made in the pod about Perth Metro and affordability. So essentially we've got buyer agents on the East Coast or in Perth Metro looking for essentially a price point, and we're talking about a price point that's down around 200k and goes up to as high as 400 or even above. And really what they're trying to do is buy a property that can get a yield in the order of 5 to 7%. And funnily enough, those metrics are in Geraldton, in certain suburbs of Geraldton, and essentially they're competing with locals as well. The locals would have sat on their hands and said, I'm not buying into this market for a long period of time, because they could literally see it going backwards. I think we bottomed out at about 100k to 150k in some of those suburbs. So now we're back at the 200s, 250s, 300s for an older style single residential dwelling on a block from 600 to 1,000 square metres. And essentially what's driving that market is the fact that it's available, it's priced well, and that it will rent in this market. So generally the economy of Gero as a town has surged backwards, and you remember last regional pod, yeah, we're having a little bit of a rant about that, and here we are, it's continuing on.
Yep. Sounds just demand-based fervour to me for no actual reasons other than it meets metrics, and that screams to me risk. People want to buy in there because they want to buy in there on a piece of paper right now, rather than because they've been there. Their lifestyle is great. They can see the economy growing.
Yeah, so the economy is growing, but what I'd really like to see is what we've seen in Karratha over a sustained period of time, and will underpin the fact that Karratha values probably hold up for a longer period of time this time around than they did in the past, and that is essentially populations solidified. People go there to live and work. You've gone from a population base of about 15,000 people, it's probably trending post 20,000 towards 25,000, and you've got diversified industries in Karratha now. Essentially, Geraldton, we're still waiting for the dream of the port to come along. There's a lot of other very important things happening around Gero that's driving the current demand, but we need significant investment in infrastructure into the future. Interestingly, there's a couple of things happening north in Kalgoorlie, some significant European money looking to do essentially green hydrogen type projects, green energy in terms of solar and wind, good spot for it. But it's just, again, it's one of those projects you hear about and you read about in business news and that kind of stuff and go, sorry, this is a significant capital increase, and the location that, as far as I can work out, north of Kalgoorlie area is very much in the middle of nowhere. And so where are you bringing the workforce from, and where are you sending your exports to? Is it going back through the Geraldton port? Is that a feasible concept? Getting your product from Kalgoorlie into Gero is no mean feat. So yeah, it just always, there's a dream there that doesn't seem to quite come to reality.
To be very transparent, Brendon, I think about these comments you're making about industries, ideas, investments, things that are in due diligence. And it reminds me of being 18, 19, 20, without any context really of what those things meant, just seeing dollar figures and photos, renders of what might be in the future, and luckily not acting on it, but seriously considering investing in places like Whyalla, for example, in South Australia, with the Olympic Dam expansion that never happened. And I think, and obviously there's a bit of furbo price going up, and you go, oh, I want to jump on this, but it's like day trading nearly. And now being far more experienced and understanding what projects are and aren't happening, it seems like red flags to me every time I see people buying in there for the sake of buying in there and jumping on a roller coaster that we don't know where the rest of the tracks are going to. Let's go to Kalgoorlie, mate. The number one unassisted salesperson for a month was a Kalgoorlie agent, Elliot Bryars, at Kalgoorlie Metro, which means there's a lot of transactions going on there right now.
Yeah, Trent, this is a really interesting story. So to link it back to commodities straight away, clearly Kalgoorlie's a gold mining town and the gold price is through the roof.
What is it now?
It's $3,000 an ounce.
So over $5 Australian.
Yeah.
I remember being in the gold industry 15 years ago talking about 2,000 Australian.
Yeah, it is amazing. And so as a result, Kalgoorlie is still running strong. There's continued upward pressure on rents, and therefore essentially capital values are still going up as well. Interestingly, local investors appear pretty active in that marketplace, and that, as opposed to maybe some other regional locations where buyer agents very much lead the market. Confidence is also playing out at the upper end of the market. So there's actually multiple large builds occurring in terms of new homes, and there's also multiple high-end sales there. And when we talk about high-end in Kalgoorlie, we're talking about post $1 million, and essentially that money gets you a large house on a large block close to town in a good location, as in a good suburb.
Close to the golf course?
Yep, exactly.
So Hannons, that sort of area?
Yeah, and there's a funny little subdivision that fits that description that's quite close to the airport, which I think is relatively amusing as you come out of the airport.
Last week we were talking about the Perth market, and just generally when people get out of the stock market because they're a bit nervous, they go into things like property. They also go into things like gold.
Yes, absolutely. Where's my safe haven? So I think obviously we would expect that probably there continues to be pressure on the gold price. So the other interesting thing about is essentially that it's still really relatively affordable because you can go to a few different suburbs there and find something at the right price. But the wage levels there, because we have a higher level of miners living in town as opposed to FIFO, essentially means that affordability crossed over with rents that are going up starts to make it actually look attractive to, if you're going to spend some time there for your career, to actually buy instead of rent.
It's like Karratha without the ridiculous house prices.
Yeah, exactly. So you would, if you're going to Karratha for a year or two and you knew that and it's a career progression for your job, there's a very low likelihood that you're going to go to Karratha and buy a property for
$1 million.
Yeah. Whereas Kalgoorlie actually still has that possibility. You rock into town, set your roots down for a year or two, and have some sort of confidence around the capital that you're putting into that property remaining steady, plus also obviously saving yourself the rent and putting that into paying a mortgage off. The other interesting thing about Kal and Kambalda in a broader market is that the nickel smelter and the market movements around that. In the past, that would have had some sort of effect on house prices in there, but from what we can see in terms of rents and transactions in Kambalda at this point in time, they're still running relatively steady and there's no market correction.
Mate, it's good to hear that Kalgoorlie is just cracking on, to be honest, and as expected. As long as there is fear in this world and chaos, the gold price will probably keep tracking along, which means that there's work to be done in Kalgoorlie, selling ever more expensive rocks out of the ground that they've been doing in the same way for the last 150 years.
Yep, and they ain't running out of supply anytime soon in terms of pulling it out of the ground. And the viability, obviously, that is going up and up all the time.
Let's go to the southwest. Where do you want to be?
Yeah, it's interesting that Busso is still strong and healthy without being really hot. Essentially, demand is still relatively strong. I think what we're seeing here, though, and what I'm trying to describe is we've got a little bit more supply, a little bit less demand, and in comparison to last year and even out to 2 years in that marketplace, it's just calming down a little bit.
So you were white hot for a few years, and then you were red hot, which is lower than white hot on our scale of hotness.
Yes.
And then you were back to white hot pre-Christmas.
Yes, yeah.
Now we're
just back at steady strength, essentially.
So we're simmering?
So we're just normal campfire campfire here. Is that
I don't know what
that?
Can we call it simmering?
Yeah, we haven't put too many more logs on the fire.
We've only had those two to choose from.
I think
for 5
simmering
years.
is very much a good term for it, and essentially it would be a lot like the upgrader market in Perth Metro at this point in time. If you went looking in Dunsborough for your own principal place of residence because you're moving there and you would like to be selective about the stock, then you're going to struggle to find heaps of options. And same if you're going to look for that perfect holiday home. If you want it to be in a certain suburb or certain little pocket close to a beach down there, it's not oversupplied. You're not going to find heaps of choice. You're going to have a limited supply that you then have to choose for and make some sort of compromise around. So values of good product will continue to grow in there. So just want to make sure that everyone doesn't think the market's going backwards. It's still really strong. It's just nowhere near as strong as it's been in the last couple of years.
Is that just because we have a little bit of an apple cross issue where none of the good ones are on the market?
Yeah, potentially. And same as if you go through the western suburbs in terms of places like Cottesloe, if you bring on a really good property in there at this point in time, it'll get snapped up within a week or two. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting to hear, and not surprising. At some point in time, I was expecting this Busselton market to just hit some price points for a while.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to see what the interest rate drops that we expect throughout the rest of the year does to the price of property. Is it a demand-supply issue? Is it an affordability cap issue?
Yeah, and
we'll find out.
Yeah, exactly. And in particular, places like Dunsborough Lake still have an upcoming supply issue. There is some new stock coming through there, but there's not a lot of new land that can be released into the future there. Yeah.
Long term.
Yep.
We're still looking at limited supply.
Yep, spot on. Now, interestingly, the comments from the team down south is that Margaret River in particular is really hot at the moment, so probably red hot, not quite white hot, but it's just really interesting. Again, it's just a bit more demand in there, maybe some people coming out of Perth Metro, maybe a little bit of that kind of flow on from Dunsborough bus home into Margaret River.
Why though? There's a lot of supply south of Margaret River with a couple of land developments there.
Yeah. So
you would have thought that'd be tempering.
So what we're seeing
points
there is those established house values go up. Essentially, the underlying land value starts to look a little bit cheap in there as well and viable. And so people piling into those markets and taking up that supply.
And building.
So in those estates they're building, I had one of our team members go through the Witchcliff Eco Village recently. He hadn't been through there for a little while. He's a non-residential valuer. So he actually called me and said, this is amazing. This is working. The housing stock's coming out of the ground, starting to look like a successful development and a real community being created there. And the commentary around Witchcliff, even 5 years ago, they got their cool little shabby chic stores there and that kind of stuff, and it was very Sleepy Hollow. Having been through there recently, there's a hive of activity and a real buzz around the town, and of course shit hot coffee.
That's important.
Yeah.
Especially when you're thinking about property.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go to Albany.
Yeah, so been in Albany in the last week or two myself, and really interesting to come to town and stay overnight. Stayed at the Hilton Gardens down there, which I hadn't done before.
Nice there. Go to the restaurant on the jetty there?
I didn't actually. I went out to Majuba Bistro, the French place in town, which was exceptional in my opinion.
Albany is exceptional though. Albany should have been WA's capital if it wasn't for the French sniffing around Swan River.
Yeah.
Albany would have been our capital. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Everyone should know that. Albany is such a beautiful part of the world. It's far more beautiful than Perth, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would argue that I'd rather swim at the beach in Perth
that's
in
true.
terms of temperatures. But
a few more sharks down there.
The harbour is ridiculous in terms of the way it looks, and just really good to see all of that investment there coming together. But it's interesting to think through what the local economy is there and what it draws into town, because it just seems to get bigger and bigger all the time. So it's an economy that is legitimately feeding on itself. So
self-fulfilling nearly.
Exactly.
And people just want to live there?
Yeah, and so that's probably some of the change here, right? So the agricultural economy underpinning the region in terms of the Great Southern has obviously been very successful in the last few years. Then you add in a few of those other bits and pieces, the tourism economy, there's the wine economy down there as well. The port obviously employs and ships out a huge amount of resources. And so what we've ended up with is Albany is a little bit like Sydney in terms of all of that geography around it limits where you can then develop. And so you end up with this constrained supply of land and therefore housing, and that's essentially where we're up to. So really difficult and really expensive to pull more land out of the ground in nice spots. And essentially all of the established stuff has either been taken up by locals. They probably all own 2 or 3 houses. They've got a couple of Airbnbs on the go. There's some amazing housing stock. I had a walk around the edges of town there, and there's some of those old character houses that are just exceptional. And so essentially the economy is thriving. Locals out looking for money, looking to invest in their own businesses, buying their own premises, those kinds of scenarios that we see when an economy is thriving.
COVID's done wonders for Albany, I think. It reminded Western Australians especially that Albany exists. place and that they should go check it out.
Yep.
And the amount of people that have moved down there or bought holiday homes down there or just Airbnb down there has just reinvigorated this whole place.
Yep.
And as you said, there's such a limited supply and opportunities for supply of new property that it's not a huge place that's growing massively. It's just that it's so hard to grow and therefore prices are looking after themselves.
Yep. And funnily enough, that flows on into Denmark. And I mention it because we've got a valuer base there, and Luke's reporting that there was actually a little bit of a slow start to the year post-Christmas, but that was essentially everyone sitting on their hands, and it's probably not dissimilarly in Albany. But funnily enough, there is some supply of vacant lots in Denmark, and the construction activity is really accelerated through there. New estates that have come out of the ground, those lots are selling quickly, and the creation of essentially new single residential dwellings in there is creating new supply and probably some new quality product into that marketplace, and remains pretty strong price growth there. And I would agree exactly with the number of times I've heard of Denmark being the destination for the relocator post-COVID. Things like having exceptional internet connection or Starlink or whatever you need to do your job. Certainly Denmark has been that tree change location that's one out of this.
Just such a beautiful part of the world. Shadforth as well, just outside of Denmark.
Yeah.
Rolling hills like the Shire from Lord of the Rings. It's a really pretty place to be.
And just exceptional beaches like the Madfish Bay and Elephant Rock and those kinds of things through there are just amazing places, yeah.
Let's finish off in Bunno.
Yeah, so Bunbury is still relatively strong. I had the pleasure of having a night at the Lord Forest Hotel recently, mate.
Haven't we all? What a great place to be.
I had to look it up. Built in 1986.
Have they renovated it in the last 20 years?
They're slowly renovating a few of the bathrooms, but very amusing to find the pool in the lobby. They've turned that into a bit of a games room, so there's air hockey and pool table as well as the pool in the lobby. But I wouldn't like to think what it would be cost to upkeep a substantial building. So yeah, it is showing signs of age here and there, but it's a really affordable place to stay and right in the middle of town. Again, it presented to me as an economy that's really thriving. I happened to be there doing some kids' sport on a Saturday morning on a nice day, and it was quite amazing to see how much activity was around the place and all age groups. So you could see the older population out doing whatever activities, lots of people exercising, through to the other thing that surprised me is out for the morning walk and a cruise ship pulled into town. The tourism economy for Bunbury as well. So value growth not as exceptional as other locations that we've just talked about, but it is also a regional hub that is feeding on itself at this point in time.
I think it just reflects the Perth market. As long as Perth gets more expensive and Bunbury continues to be a viable little sister to Perth, people will keep falling off the wagon in Perth and ending up rolling down the hill to Bunbury. I just see it as Perth's secondary alternative.
And employment remaining strong there. So.
Even without lithium being massive.
Yeah.
Imagine what will happen when that does eventually turn at some point with the onset of EVs in the future.
Yep.
Mate, thanks for the update. It's been a nice 20 minutes going around the state. Great stories.
Thanks, mate.
Speak to you at the financial year, hey?
Oh,
thanks,
crazy.
Man.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!